Hi, I'm Rabbi Jeremy from Mahar, and this is the last of our August 2020 Torah Roundup videos. As I mentioned, our text on Tuesday's classes usually has a Torah portion roundup thing for the end of each month, but given Elul and preparations for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we're really just taking the Torah portions and talking about them by video. Access them as you need to or are interested in doing. And we've covered the other 4 Torah portions that were read in August 2020. It was a big month for Shabbats, 5 Shabbats, 5 Torah portions. So this is our last Torah portion. This is our last Parsha. This is Parshat Ki Teitzei. Ki Teitzei is when you go out to war. That's how the Torah portion opens. And the specific text in question here is actually kind of a shocking one. So Ki Teitzei is when you go out to war and you capture women and you take a shine to one of the women and you want her to be your wife. What are the things that she has to do to become an Israelite? And she's supposed to shave her head and mourn, and there's a process that she's supposed to go through, after which point the Israelite man can marry her and she is viewed as an Israelite. We also have a discussion of the rebellious son and punishment of the rebellious son by death. The rabbis seem to believe that this particular punishment was actually never imposed. We actually have a lot. This is our Torah portion here. A lot of individual rules. We're getting to the part of Deuteronomy where we're really repeating the rules. Some of them are newer, are specific to Deuteronomy, and some are not. So we have a rule that you shouldn't leave somebody who's been executed, you shouldn't leave their body hanging in a tree overnight. You need to help people restore lost property. You have some kind of prohibition on men wearing women's clothes and women wearing men's clothes. There are a number of modern attempts to interpret this as not really applying to a number of situations that matter very much to the LGBTQI community. I'm not totally convinced that the authors of Deuteronomy would have really liked the idea of an LGBTQI community at all. So sometimes a text just isn't salvageable for our modern use, and this may be one of them. What else? There's a long list here, as you can see. There's a verse that's actually really central to how the rabbis view the history of Jewish heresy. There's an instruction that when you find a bird's nest and you want to take the eggs or the chicks from the nest, that you should chase away the mother bird. And the rationale given is not, well, it's cruel to do this in front of the mother, or it's cruel to take both the chicks and the mother. The explanation is so that you will live a long life and a prosperous life, which is the same rationale given for honoring your father and your mother. So there's a story in the Talmud about a former rabbi named Elisha ben Abuya. Elisha ben Abuya is reported to have become an apostate. There are several different explanations given. One of the explanations is he was walking along the road and he saw a child climb a ladder to chase away the mother bird. He had been doing this at his parents' request to get the eggs. He fell from the ladder and died. So Elisha ben Abuya sees this child die while he's fulfilling 2 commandments that are each supposed to promise long life. And the rabbis say, well, this is one of the reasons he became an apostate. And the response in the Talmud is, well, that's because he didn't know the right way to interpret this verse. This verse is a metaphor, and it's really talking about the world to come and having a long life in the world to come. But this is reported as one of the key things for one of the few recognized apostates in the Torah, in the Talmud. We get a rule that you have to put a parapet on your roof, right? Somebody's on your roof so they don't fall. We get a discussion of wearing tzitzit. We get a discussion of the idea that hybrids or mixed varieties are forbidden. We get a number of different examples. So one of them is don't plant two different kinds of seeds together. So hybridization of plants is perhaps viewed as a problem. We also get don't wear shotnets. So shotnets is a combination of wool and linen. You're not supposed to wear wool and linen in the same garment. You're not supposed to lash an ox and a donkey together. So there are this idea that things have to be non-mixed in certain circumstances. The shotnets rule in particular remains important today. And it's very common for people who are particularly observant of the rule about shotnets will have clothing that they've bought, if they've bought it from a non-Jewish manufacturer, a non-Jewish store, will take it to a Jewish tailor whose business includes inspecting the clothing to ensure it does not violate the rules of shotnets. They don't trust the label fully, essentially. We get what happens if there are claims of adultery that are false, claims of adultery that are true. And specifically what we're talking about here is when a man marries a woman whom he believes is a virgin and then he decides she's not. So if he makes a false claim, he has to pay money to rehabilitate her reputation. If the claim is true, she's punished. She's actually supposed to be stoned. So again, there are progressive rules compared to the rest of the ancient world about women. In some places of the Torah, this isn't one of those places. We have rules about rape. Did somebody need to scream out? What happens if the woman was betrothed to somebody else or married to somebody else? And what happens if the woman was a virgin? If the woman was a virgin, this is really, really one of those why, because it doesn't seem very progressive for the time at all, except in some ways it does. So the why here is, when this happens, the Torah says, if you rape a virgin in a field, you have to marry her and you can't divorce her. And this is, in the setting of the time, a way of providing for welfare for somebody who the society would view as damaged goods. The idea that somebody is viewed as damaged goods is quite misogynistic, and it is an idea we still carry in modern times. From a socioeconomic perspective, maybe this is a little progressive for the ancient world. We then start to get rules about who can convert and who can't, who can become an Israelite and who can't. And we are told Ammonites and Moabites, because of things that they did to Israelites, according to the book of Numbers, people from those tribes can't convert. Never mind that by the time Deuteronomy is written, we may not even know who Moabites are or who Ammonites are. Setting that to the side, there are limits on who can join, essentially. However, Edomites are viewed as being siblings to Israelites. This is because Edom and Esau, Jacob and Esau, these are the same tribe. The Torah views the Edomites as Esau's descendants, and so it says, well, actually, those people can join pretty easily. If an Edomite marries an Israelite, their children can be Israelites out to the third generation. There's a better view of Edomites taken in Deuteronomy, which becomes really, really ironic, because over time, the rabbis will begin to associate the Romans, who they did not like, with Edom. And that will be the code word they use to talk about Romans in many texts. So this, we like the Edomites, is an ironic thing in the broader course of Jewish history. We get a rule about not returning escaped slaves. We get a rule about no unclean people can be in a military camp and how you deal with that. We get no cultic prostitution. We get no interest on loans to Israelites. This is a long list of rules. you shouldn't make vows, but you got to follow through if you make the vows. Better just to not make vows, which is an idea that gets echoed elsewhere in the Torah and Proverbs and elsewhere. We get divorce. That only men can initiate divorce. This is not a progressive rule. This is pretty in keeping with ancient Near Eastern law of the time. We get some rules about lending money. And most of the translations you see use the word pledge. Pledge isn't quite the right word for the way we talk about borrowing money in our time. The right word here is collateral. So we get a number of rules in Teitzei about what you can take as collateral when you loan money to assure that you get paid back. And there are things you are told you cannot take as collateral, and there are ways you cannot collect on your collateral. So one example is you can't take a millstone, because people use millstones to grind flour, to grind wheat or other grain to make bread. And the Torah says the millstone is life. You can't take that. You can't take that as a pledge. It also says you can't keep a garment that's pledged to you by a poor person. You can't sleep in it overnight. You have to give it back because this is really the only clothing they have. You have to give it back. Maybe you can take it again the next day, but you can't sleep in it. It's got to be given back to the person. Same for widows. We get a description of who goes to war and who doesn't. And if people have haven't planted a field yet, or haven't harvested, if they've recently been married and they haven't consummated the marriage, if they're afraid, if they don't have to join the military, not everybody has to go to war. So this is a really interesting text to kind of say there are life priorities that come before serving in the military. And essentially the Torah is saying, but God should be on your side when you go to war. We get, you shouldn't be engaged in the human trafficking of Israelites. So it actually says, if you go stealing Israelites and selling them into slavery, you have a problem. This is against the rules that are in Deuteronomy. Note that it's only Israelites. So this text isn't expressly condoning what we would call human trafficking, but it seems to condone human trafficking. It says to follow what the priests say about leprosy, because following the rules of leprosy is central to purity and impurity issues for the temple. It actually has an interesting description of what you can't do when you're going to get collateral from somebody, that you can't help yourself. You can't just walk into their house. You have to ask them to bring it out. That there's still this idea of human dignity when you are engaged in lending. You're not supposed to withhold payment of wages from somebody who's poor. If you have a worker who's poor, you have to pay them that day because they depend on the money that day to eat. We have a discussion. This is interesting in comparison to something else we looked at in Deuteronomy. So we had this discussion of the idea earlier in Deuteronomy that God visits the sins of the fathers onto subsequent generations. We have a rule here that says that fathers are not to be killed for the sins of their sons, nor sons killed for the sins of their fathers. So there's a little bit of tension here between this one, where punishment isn't passed down back and forth between generations, and the theological statement earlier in Deuteronomy that in fact punishment does get passed down a few generations and righteousness gets passed down 1,000 generations. So we have some other issues to think through. There are other issues. There's tension here. And it's very likely that the prior discussion was the idea of communal punishment, which is the theological through the theological thread that runs through Deuteronomy is violating the commandments results in full punishment of the nation, not you specifically engaging in an action will or won't prosper from it. What else? There's lots and lots of rules here. This is an interesting one, we have the discussion of levirate marriage. So levirate marriage is the idea that if a man and a woman marry, and the man dies without children, the widow is to be married by the man's brother, unless the brother doesn't want to marry the woman, or the woman doesn't want to marry the brother. If the woman doesn't want to marry the brother, there's a procedure called chalitza. Chalitza literally refers to drawing off a sandal, because a sandal is taken off and handed over as part of a ritual that says the woman doesn't wish to marry her dead husband's brother, and this is her refusal of the marriage. Again, something that is very strange by our standards, but seems like it is an attempt to ensure some level of financial security for the widow, while also ensuring inheritance for the dead husband, because the first child that comes from the union of the dead husband's brother and the widow is supposed to be, for legal purposes at least, the child of the dead husband. We have an instruction that measures should be just, right? Don't weight your scales and don't mess with how measuring is done. We have an interesting rule. If two men are fighting and the wife of one of the men intervenes by grabbing the private area of the other man in the fight, the woman's hand, according to Deuteronomy, is supposed to be cut off. Again, here's another rule. Take it for what it is, which is justice 2,600 years ago. And then we have finally the rule that Amalek, the tribe that was reported to have attacked the Israelites as soon as they crossed the Red Sea, Amalek is to be blotted out. Those are our Torah portions for August 2020. I hope I'll see you on some other time, maybe with a smaller list of rules than we had in Teitzei.